Back in June 2019, at a small gaming conference called E3, Microsoft quietly dropped a bombshell on the flight simulator community. During the Xbox conference, of all things, they played a trailer for a new Microsoft Flight Simulator title, their first addition to the franchise in 10 years. It looked phenomenal, almost too good to be true. And while many were excited, many more were skeptical, even concerned. How could they achieve that level of visual fidelity in real time? Why was Microsoft coming back to the flight simulator market after so long? And was this going to be an authentic flight simulator, or just another Xbox arcade game for the lowest common denominator? Well, we got the answers we wanted, and much, much more. A couple of weeks ago, myself and a bunch of flight sim enthusiasts and members of the press were invited to a global preview event of the new Microsoft Flight Simulator. Microsoft flew us out to Renton Airfield in Seattle, where we were given a presentation, had a Q&A session with the dev team, and then we were allowed to get hands-on with a pre-alpha version of the new flight sim. Now, Microsoft covered most of the expenses for that trip. However, the views you will get in this video are entirely my own. The footage you'll see was provided by Microsoft and is pre-alpha footage from the sim. So why did Microsoft come back to the flight simulator market after 10 years? Their answer: a convergence of technologies. Microsoft believes that a number of technologies have evolved to the point where they can be brought together to take a leap forward in flight simulation. Microsoft searched the globe for the right development team to help build their new flight simulator. They eventually settled on Asobo, a French game studio renowned for their work on large-scale gaming worlds, and well respected within Microsoft for their work on several Kinect and HoloLens titles. Okay, let's go into detail on Microsoft Flight Simulator. In the presentation, the devs focused on 4 key areas: the world, the sky, aerodynamics, and the cockpit. Let's start with the world. Throughout the history of flight simulation, one goal has always been to accurately and realistically present the world outside. From wireframe, the shaded buildings, textured fields and solid trees, to ortho scenery and OSM road data, flight sims have certainly come a long way. So what is the next step? Well, Microsoft think that it's a one-to-one representation of the entire world with accuracy down to just centimeters. Now that sounds crazy, but with the insane amount of data available in Microsoft Bing Maps, it's actually possible. Just look at this. Microsoft Flight Simulator will have a complete representation of the Earth, with satellite images down to 3 centimeters, aerial imagery down to 5 centimeters, and photogrammetry down to 3 centimeters, even using elevation data and 3D scans of over 400 cities. And all of this using only 2 petabytes of Bing mapping data. All the cities across the world are represented, and all the airports, that's over 40,000 of them. But even Bing Maps does not have all the required data. For example, trees. There is no data for this, only images, so they developed machine learning and computer vision-based algorithms to detect all the trees in the world, an estimated 1.5 trillion of them, and generate the tree placement data for Microsoft Flight Simulator to use. Similar techniques were used to improve building generation. Despite all this, capturing of fine details is impossible. Ground details such as grass, dirt, asphalt, and signage have to be procedurally generated. Grass is rendered as millions of 3D grass blades, and water is affected by wind, which in turn creates waves. The first consequence of representing the world in this way is that you can fly VFR everywhere in the simulator and it will match the real world. Now you're probably thinking, I'm going to have to buy a pretty big hard drive if I'm going to run this sim. How does Microsoft expect me to store 2 petabytes of data on my PC? Simple answer, it doesn't. Microsoft is leveraging its Azure platform to deliver scenery data to you on demand. Azure provides storage and delivery at very low latencies, and Asobo have a proprietary engine that can work on gigantic worlds. Together, they will stream world data to your PC as you fly. So now you're probably wondering if your internet speed is going to cope with streaming world data in real time, or if your sim is going to stutter on final because your sister decided to start up Netflix. And do you really want your flight sim requiring a fast internet connection at all times? Well, Microsoft has thought of that too. The sim measures the bandwidth you have available and chooses the level of detail to stream accordingly. The better your bandwidth, the better the visuals. But what if you don't want to stay connected whilst you play? Pre-caching allows you to download regions of the world for offline access. This lets you enjoy the same experience you would have enjoyed online, but in an offline setting. In the extreme case where no internet connection is available at all, Microsoft has developed a free offline mode that they say is still reasonably accurate and allows you to fly VFR. Well, that covers everything on the ground, but we're flight simmers, and that means the sky is just as, if not more, important. Above the surface of the Earth, of course, sits the atmosphere, complex, dynamic, and difficult to simulate with a high degree of realism. So how does Microsoft Flight Simulator tackle this? In real life, especially in VFR, if there's a cloud in front of you, you might have to deviate left or right, up or down. The type and look of clouds informs the pilot and depicts the general weather. It has to be consistent and accurate. In the sim, the atmosphere is split into 32 layers, each of which define the density, shape, and fuzziness of the clouds. All the clouds are affected by the wind current. In fact, the clouds themselves are built from the humidity in the atmospheric layer, and the sim supports any type of cloud natively. Weather data is streamed live and rendered locally on your PC. The cloud rendering extends to 600 kilometers, which is basically the distance you can see from high levels of altitude. The engine natively supports everything natural weather would do. Storms, rain, wind, gusts all contribute to conditions outside your aircraft, which means you'll have to cope with wind shear and jet streams. Rendering of the sky is quite something. Sunlight, skylight, moonlight, city lights, aircraft lights all affect the cloud rendering, which in turn scatters the light. Clouds reflect light onto each other. Same thing for humidity and pollution. Clouds cast shadows on the scenery, buildings, water, and mountains. Mountains even cast shadows on the clouds. There are full day-night cycles, but also yearly cycles, so the position of the sun varies depending on the time of day and the time of year. Same with the moon, which also lights the night sky in the clouds. The night sky itself is accurately modelled too, with all stars correctly represented. All the lighting is physically based. Overcast, dreary days cause the sea and reflections to look dark. Switch to a clear day and the sea reflects the clear blue sky, with building reflections more vivid. All clouds are volumetric, so when you fly in and through a cloud, it really does feel like you're actually inside one. Taken together, the sky simulation and rendering is, quite simply, phenomenal. Well, that's all very impressive, but this is first and foremost a flight simulator. So let's turn our attention to more aviation aspects, namely aerodynamics and the flight model. This new simulator has been built on FSX, but the aerodynamics system from FSX has been completely rewritten. How the atmosphere interacts with the aircraft has also been overhauled. In FSX, an aircraft was simulated using a point in the middle that was fed atmospheric data. Lookup tables were then used to decide what would happen under certain scenarios. Now, instead of one point, it's thousands. Thousands of little surfaces which are placed all around the plane and correctly simulated individually. Each surface has a full aerodynamic simulation. This includes air pressure, wind speed moments, and stalling. A surface can stall, and this includes dynamic stalls, static stalls, and you get exact lift and drag. That means that a piece of the plane can stall. You can stall the edge of the right wing, the middle of the right wing, etc. Wind simulation is worldwide, and you get an accurate representation of the airflow. For example, clouds create an updraft, and in a larger storm formation, there's an updraft on the outside and downdraft in the middle. This is totally volumetric, and depending on where you fly, that impacts the plane. Because the plane itself is now thousands of surfaces, it's going to impact the plane surface by surface. When the wind comes together, it creates turbulence. From big mountains, which can create very strong turbulence, to very small things like trees, buildings, and stadiums. They will each create turbulence, and when you fly through it, the aircraft will be affected. Landing gear and external tanks will also affect aerodynamic performance. The devs say the FSX flight model was too stiff and resisted change too much. The new integrator allows for more accurate simulation of acrobatics, stalls, and spins. It also makes these calculations more frequently. It adapts to your frame rate too, so if you have a high frame rate, it will make these calculations every single frame. All the aircraft in the sim have been reviewed by experienced pilots who have over 20,000 hours on that specific aircraft. So each aircraft should not only be mathematically correct, but also feel right. Let's talk about the core physics. There are two major improvements according to the devs. Firstly, the collision model. They made it so that you can contact any surface or any slope. Most runways are not completely flat. Well, now you can take off and land on irregular surfaces. This also applies to fields. If you do emergency landings or engine failures, that kind of thing, when you land in a field and take off again, it will correctly simulate the slope of the field. The second thing to change is the friction model, which they say is now realistic. Static friction, dynamic friction, it simulates tyre rubber exactly, so taxiing and takeoff, especially when there's turbulence and crosswind, feels more realistic now. We've covered the world, the sky, and the aerodynamics, but what about the aircraft we'll be flying? At the global preview event, we had access to 3 aircraft in the sim: the Cessna 172 Skyhawk, the Robin DR400, and the Cicada TBM 900. However, in the E3 video back in June, there are at least half a dozen more aircraft shown, which means the current number of aircraft that will be available on release day is unknown. Visually, aircraft look stunning, inside and out. They are lit and rendered beautifully. As in the real world, outside conditions greatly affect the ability to read instrumentation inside the cockpit. Lighting is accurate too, with every bulb in the instrumentation panel providing light. Instruments can have dirtiness, glass can be scratched, and shadows are cast across the panel. All buttons, switches and dials are clickable, and touchscreen systems fully interactive. There'll be a complete checklist system, and you can control the level of detail you require. Everything from turning it off to full automatic start of the aircraft. There's also a guided mode, which will highlight the switches in the cockpit and confirm when sequences are completed. The sound system is accurately modelled as well, with both positional and environmental effects applied using DSP for real-time sound simulation. When I flew the aircraft under sim, I can tell you that the audioscape was fantastic. On the peripheral side of things, there's a completely new tool that allows the tuning of peripherals directly. Everything from axis setups to dead zones and calibration. The devs at Asobo are inspired by the home cockpit scene, even building their own in the office for everyone to use. So they'll be also supplying tools to allow integration with home cockpits. So that covers most of the facts that were relayed to us on the day. I was fortunate enough to spend well over 3 hours hands-on with the sim, so we're now going to talk a little bit about my experiences. When I first fired up the sim, it placed us in a Cessna 172 at Renton, which is the airfield that we were actually at. Now, we were staying at a hotel about, I'd say, half a kilometre away from the airfield, and so I had a pretty good idea of the layout. And when I took off, the first thing I did was look to the right to try and see the hotel that I was staying at, and sure enough, it was there. In fact, I started to look really closely to get a feeling for how accurate this thing was. All the buildings, including the Boeing factory, was there. The trees, unless you look really closely, they looked pretty realistic. I was very, very impressed. So after flying around Seattle and looking at the skyscrapers and the landscape, which was absolutely phenomenal, I have to say, it was so realistic. In fact, the Seattle is one of the most complete areas they have in the sim at the moment. But I flew over to London, not literally. I stopped the sim and then restarted again over at London. In fact, I took off out of Earl's Cone, which is the airfield that I fly out of. Now, considering that Earl's Cone airfield was just shipping out of the box it wasn't bad representation of Earlscone Airfield, although tarmac wasn't quite right. I took off, I flew over to Southend. Southend was done very, very well. I then flew down over London to the Thames, and that's when I started to notice some scenery problems. I noticed a lot of the bridges over the Thames weren't present. A lot of the buildings weren't there. The key ones were, like the Houses of Parliament and the Shard and that kind of thing, but clearly there's still more work to be done in London. So after London, I then headed up to North Weald Airfield and tried to follow the A414 that goes from North Weald towards Chelmsford. This is a road I know very well. But on the weather, I'd selected cloudy and rainy. And what happened was this cell came in as I was flying along. So I started off being able to see the 414 and fly visually, VFR, and just follow the road towards Chelmsford. And then this cell came in real time, and everything just went misty, and then the rain started hitting the cockpit window, and I lost complete visibility. Then I came out the other side of the cloud, and I was disoriented. Now this is the kind of thing that you have to be very careful when you fly in real life, because now I didn't know where I was. I eventually managed to find my position, picked up the 414, and carried on towards Chelmsford. When I got to Chelmsford, I decided to try and find my house. So I looked for a few key landmarks, tipped the wing, looked down, and sure enough, there was my house. There's a different car outside, but I have to say it was quite phenomenal to see my house in this sim. Next thing I did, I went down to Innsbruck. Now Innsbruck is one of those places that in a sim I always go to just to see what it looks like. I have to say, the visual fidelity of Innsbruck was on a par with Aerofly FS2 Orbex Innsbruck. It really was that good. The cool thing though was I decided to then take the 172 and fly it fairly close to the hills and the mountains. As at that point I started to feel the downdraft and the updrafts and the turbulence that they talked about with the Aerodynamics simulation. That was really, really cool. I then jumped over to Key West. Now Key West is one of those things that it's just beautiful any time of day that you fly it. But while I was flying along to Key West, which I was doing it in the TBM 900, I left the landing lights turned on. So I had these lights bright shining forward. And I then brought up the time of day slider. And the time of day slider allows you to just move around through the time of day, and you can see the sun move all in real time. And I have to say, at that point, I was simply gobsmacked. I moved the time of day down to sort of early morning, and it was all purple and orangey. The clouds were lit absolutely wonderfully. I then directly flew the plane into a cloud, and you can see the landing lights just volumetrically lighting up the cloud. And then as we came out, I started sliding around the timer again. The sea turned to this wonderful turquoise blue. I flew low level down towards the beaches. They were all accurately simulated. And then I switched it to nighttime, and down came the moon, and you could even see aspects of the Milky Way. There was one point where I just left the plane flying straight and level and just sat back and looked at the sim and thought, this is unbelievable. I can easily generate 1 million screenshots on my desktop from this sim. It was just gobsmacking at that point. So how would I summarize what I saw? Well, I went to this preview event with an open mind. And when I came away and thought about what I'd seen and what they'd told me, it got me thinking that this sim is pulling together technologies that simply didn't exist 10 years ago. It's doing something that no other flight sim on the market yet has. In fact, it would probably be very hard, if not impossible, to retrofit some of the technology that this simulator is going to use into one of the existing flight sims. And for that reason, I think things are about to take a massive leap forward. I will of course bring more information and footage of the sim as soon as I am able to. But make no mistake, this product is going to change the flight simulation market in a very big way. Take care guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Happy flying.